Welcome back to Alex Academy, where we're going to talk about Chapter 3, Early African Societies and the Bantu Migrations now. So, of course, we talked about Mesopotamia, but now the focus really shifts to Africa, another huge source of human development. So the first thing to know is there was climatic change in Africa, and that was a really big deal. So about 10,000 BC, you had the Sahara region, which of course is desert today. It actually was a grassy steppe and there was lots of water in it, so that allowed permanent settlements and agriculture such as sorghum and yams to develop. And once these developed, kingdoms started arising. The two most notable ones are Egypt and Nubia, and these are also called the Gifts of the Nile. So Egypt took the lower third of the Nile, while Nubia took the middle third of the Nile. The Nile River, of course, is one of the longest rivers in the world, and if you didn't know, it flows from the south to the north, which sort of breaks convention. The north is actually where the Mediterranean Sea is, so it's still emptying into a sea. It's just kind of weird. And so Egypt was closer to the Mediterranean Sea, of course, and we'll see that playing later. Also, because Egypt had sort of, I guess, the better part of the Nile River, which had more flooding and silt deposits, agriculture was easier there. But it was also easier for Nubia, just a little less easier because they didn't have as great lands as Egypt. So these two empires sort of arise, but the biggest one is Egypt, of course, and they become a large and prosperous state by 3100 BC. And then this dude named Menes unites Upper and Lower Egypt. Egypt was divided at that time at a city called Memphis, and he really establishes himself as the first pharaoh, which is the absolute ruler that owns all the land of Egypt. And right after him comes the Old Kingdom, which is the first of really three periods and three kingdoms of Egypt. And during this time, there was a lot of great stuff. For example, the Great Pyramids of Egypt were built. So basically, how we associate Egypt today, all the pyramids were built during that time. Also, Nubia sort of starts fighting with Egypt, which doesn't turn out well. So as a result, Nubia really tries to quell the conflicts by intermarrying and also giving some of their soldiers away to Egypt through mercenaries. And eventually Nubia cannot survive and they develop into the kingdom of Kush. So after the Old Kingdom, there was upheaval, and then came the Middle Kingdom. During the Middle Kingdom, nomadic horsemen known as the Hyksos invade Egypt, and they used bronze weapons and chariots, which the Egyptians did not have. And this really caused a lot of revolts, which eventually led to the New Kingdom. And in the New Kingdom, the people were tired of foreigners ruling, so they decided to give the pharaoh more power. And the pharaoh also established a huge army and a large bureaucracy, which is like a sort of series of people to assist the pharaoh. And then you have powerful pharaohs such as King Tut come out of this time. But eventually, all good things have to end, and the Assyrians with their iron weapons eventually invade from the north, ending it. And a fun fact about pharaohs is that pharaohs had to marry. Pharaohs were usually guys, although there were one or two female pharaohs, but they had to marry their sisters, so the blood would stay pure, I guess. This is just really something we think is kind of weird or nasty today. And next we have the formation of complex societies and sophisticated cultural traditions. So the cities were not as prominent in Egypt as in Mesopotamia because Mesopotamia had more agricultural villages and they just had more people there. But the Egyptians really worshipped in a Heliopolis, which is the center of the sun god. They really believed in gods and deities like that. And of course you had your normal social classes. So Egypt, they had the pharaohs at the top with the bureaucracy, the professional military and administrators under them, and then peasants and slaves working on agriculture at the end. And just like Mesopotamia, patriarchy was a huge deal. But it's really important to note that Egyptian women had more power than Mesopotamian women, although it's still less than men. And you also have Egypt establish some trade networks because in addition to agriculture, they really wanted to trade, and they traded a ton of stuff listed right here. You can read it for yourself, but they were a big part of the early Mediterranean trade. And then you have the hieroglyphics, which are important. Those are found on monuments and papyrus, which is reed paper made back in the day. And this was really sort of one of the first types of writing, except in Egypt it was different. It was more like characters. It wasn't Phoenician alphabet with like the sounds. So this was really revolutionary, and this is definitely one of the earliest forms of writing we have today. And as I said earlier, they were huge worshippers of gods, so they had a ton of gods, and the pharaoh was almost considered as a god many of the times. And when the pharaoh died, of course, they would have the classic mummification. At first, only the pharaohs were mummified, but later, ruling classes and the wealthy elite could afford it, so they got mummified too. And eventually, commoners would have it later on. And now we shift to Bantu migrations. The Bantu were really this language group from West Central Africa, and they were these migratory peoples, and they migrated a ton. Like, so many hundreds of years later, they were still migrating. But these people are really important. They had some certain characteristics you can read here. And they also moved south eventually to the Congo River and spread out to all corners of Africa. So basically, a lot of Africans have Bantu heritage in their blood. And one of their greatest technology was iron weapons. So not all people in Africa had iron weapons, and when they had it, they got the stronger position. And eventually, as a final note, so Africa and Egypt in general, a lot of them worship ancestors or local gods for intervention if they needed help. And also spiritual, like spirit worship, was a big deal. So that was sort of their religious background in Africa. They were animistic and they worshiped spirits. And much mixing and intermingling of cultures, of course, occurred with the Bantu migrations and all the trading going on. So that's really just Africa for you in a snap. So this has been Chapter 3, Early African Societies and the Bantu Migrations. Thanks for watching, and hope to see you next time.